SoundCartel.
In most podcast episodes, a call to action is the last thing your listeners will hear. Andrew Davies is the digital and engagement editor at ABC Audio Studios and Radio National, and he joins us to discuss how these small sign-offs can make a huge difference to audience engagement and podcast discoverability.
I'm not saying ratings and reviews aren't important. Clearly, if you're doing a podcast and you've got 300 people saying nice reviews about your show, that's a really good thing for the show. But in terms of that link between ratings and reviews leading to higher rankings on the Apple chart and other charts, that's actually not the case.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 10 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hello, Nick. It's stupendous to be back with you once more.
Yes, stupendous indeed. Now, before we get to Andrew, it's worth mentioning that the British Podcast Awards were held recently. Particularly for brands thinking about producing a podcast, it's interesting to hear what the judges said about the winning branded and winning business podcasts. So first, the branded podcast, Gardening with HRS, the Royal Horticultural Society. It's an interview and advice podcast that the experts said equally engages new and established gardeners, and that it contains an assortment of beautifully told, diverse, relatable and heartfelt stories.
That's right. And what we say often, Nick, is that brands really need to engage their new and existing audiences. And there is a really great way to do it, and this podcast has clearly done that. And also telling stories from a very personal place, lived experiences, which these guests have obviously had, is a perfect way to get the listener engaged and really loving the show.
Mm-hmm.
And the best business podcast was Doing It for the Kids. It's also an advice and interview show, but for parents that happen to be freelancers. The judges in this case called it funny, intelligent and interactive, and a series that totally understands its target audience. They also said that the podcast was particularly valuable during a lockdown year.
I think the key there is totally understand its target audience.
Yeah.
How many times do we say, start with your audience in mind, produce the podcast for your audience?
Who are your audience? Mm-hmm. Where are they? Exactly.
Now, let's get to our chat with Andrew Davies. Andrew is the digital and engagement editor at ABC Audio Studios and Radio National. We spoke to him last year on Podcasting Essentials about the importance of titles and descriptions. But this time, we're discussing his latest passion, calls to action. Andrew, welcome again to Podcasting Essentials.
Hey, Andrew, welcome back. So happy to have you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nicole. Great to be back.
Now, Andrew, you're moving on from your self-diagnosed obsession with podcast titles and descriptions to calls to action. And the one that we probably hear the most is at the end of an episode, please leave us a rating and review. There's a perception that these ratings and reviews actually lead to higher ratings in podcast app charts. But is this actually true?
Well, it's a good question. And yes, I think I've probably exhausted my colleagues and maybe the industry at large by talking about episode descriptions for a couple of years. So I thought I'd probably sort of better move on to a new niche topic and bore everyone about that for a couple of years. But in answer to your specific question, yes, one of the things I've been frustrated about for a while is hearing that call to action at the end of an episode where it says, if you like this show, leave a rating or review. It'll help improve discovery or help other people find the show. And I've often been wondering about, well, is that actually the case? And luckily, James Cridland, the editor of Pod News, who's been a regular guest on this show, I know, did a interesting piece of research or followed up with Apple Podcasts late last year. So this is late 2020. And he got in touch to ask how their chart or their ranking system actually worked. And I think I'm right in saying that this was their first on-the-record response about the charts or the ranking system. And they said, and I'm quoting here, that the charts were calculated from a mix of new subscriptions, playback activity and completion rates, And they also said to James that ratings and reviews aren't factored into the charts. So given that, I think it's really useful or important for podcasters to take account of that and not use that kind of same wording at the end of their podcasts or their episodes when it comes to a call to action. I'm not saying ratings and reviews aren't important. Clearly, if you're doing a podcast and you've got 300 people saying nice reviews about your show, that's a really good thing for the show. But in terms of that link between ratings and reviews leading to higher rankings on the Apple chart and other charts, that's actually not the case, certainly from Apple's statement. So that's what I'm really trying to encourage people to not use that language, because there isn't that link based on James's research.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, you also have some best practice advice on the way to go about inserting calls to action into podcasts. And the first one is the one-shot rule.
Yes, this is something that I can't claim any credit for coining. I'm actually borrowing this from a woman called Amanda McLaughlin, who's a New York-based podcaster, and she wrote an article a couple of years ago for the Bellow Collective website, and she coined this term that she called the one-shot rule, and that basically means that each podcast episode should have one call to action. Now, I often hear presenters of shows give out a list of different calls to action at the end of shows or as part of their episodes. And Amanda's point was that your listeners are likely to be doing other things while they're listening to your show. So if you have one simple call to action, then A, people are more likely to remember that, and B, importantly, people are more likely to follow through on that. And if you think about that as a listener, I think that makes sense. So that's what I'm encouraging people to think about, is to use one simple, well-established, clear call to action that your listeners can take up, rather than applying 4 or 5 different calls to action that probably you're wasting your time or your audience's time by using.
If we're only going to have one shot, should it be at the start, the middle, or the end?
That's a great question, Nick. And I think I'm someone who doesn't actually believe in having stuff at the end of episodes necessarily. It's really got to suit the nature and the format of your show. So if there's an opportunity to use it in the middle of the show, or 3/4 of the way through the show, or following an interview that you've done as part of your show, then I think you should take that. You shouldn't necessarily apply a sort of one-size-fits-all approach by having it at the end of an episode. So I think that's really up to the podcaster, the show, the format, and at what best works in terms of saying that as part of the show.
Am I allowed to have one at the middle and then a different one at the end, or does that break the one-shot rule?
Again, I'm open to ideas around that, and I'm sure Amanda would be as well. I think it's really about what works best and also how effective it is as well, right? I think you've got to be strategic with your time and not overscript these things. So if you're going to do 2, that's totally fine. I am not going to send you a nasty email saying you've done 2 as part of your show.
So we talked about the leave a rating and review call to action, but there are actually many other actions that we want people to take as a result of listening to our podcast, like buying merchandise or listening to another podcast as part of a cross-promotion. You have a range of calls to action to consider. Would you mind going through some of them and how they fit in with the one-shot rule?
Yeah, sure. I spoke about this recently at the Podcast Day 24 event. And I think there are a few things that people should think about. One might be sending ideas for future stories. When you're encouraging your audience, if they've heard a great interview, you can follow up with, and if you've got another great idea for an interview, then please get in touch. That's one that might be relevant. If you're making more than one show, so encouraging your audience to check out another podcast that you might make or might be a guest on, I think that's a really useful one as well. Sharing via social channels, really important and a really useful way of engaging your audience further. And that comes back to thinking about the behavior of your audience and understanding as much as you can about your audience. Other things that come to mind are listening to a previous episode on a relevant topic. So, for example, if you're doing a show about food and there's another episode that might relate, then you can encourage your audience to go back to listen to another episode. The archive of a podcast is really valuable. Smart speakers, we know that people are listening to podcasts on smart speakers, so encouraging your audience who might want to listen that way is a really valuable call to action that can be used. Merch, obviously, never goes out of fashion. Stickers, T-shirts, caps, whatever. That's really valuable, particularly, and can be useful for podcasts. And I think the other thing I'd mention is engagement. So whether that's voice memos, which are increasingly popular for audiences to engage via audio, and people often like hearing their questions or their points used as part of a show, or if it's people sending in an email or a tweet or a Facebook comment. So there are just some different options that you can think about as part of your calls to action. But I would again think about that one-shot rule and think about it strategically as to how you use that as part of your show rather than using 4 or 5 at once.
Well, I'm going to break that rule and use one of them right now to tell our listeners to go back and listen to the interview with you, Andrew, which was episode 1 of season 4, where we talked about descriptions and titles and the importance of them, because I still think that's one of the most important and somewhat overlooked areas of the production of your podcast content. So go back and have a listen to that one, and then we'll get back on with the show.
After you've listened to this episode.
Absolutely.
Don't leave now. But Andrew, you also say it's important to make calls to action easy and benefit-driven. Do you have a couple of examples?
Yeah, sure. In terms of ease, I guess what I'm thinking about is if you're encouraging your audience to do something, don't make them go through 4 steps to do that. So if you're encouraging them to watch a related video or read a related article that you might have written on your website or your blog, then make it really obvious and clear how to actually get to that. So, for example, put that link prominently on your website or put that video prominently on your website so that then you can say, go to the website and watch the video rather than going through 4 steps to get to the video or to the articles. And the benefit driven really, I think, points back to the article that Amanda McLaughlin wrote. And again, I'm kind of picking up on her point here, but the benefit driven should explain to the audience if they're taking an action that you're encouraging them to do, well, what's the benefit for the show? What's the benefit in terms of what they would get from doing that? And I think one of the best examples I've heard relates to those podcasts that use Patreon as a way of encouraging their audiences to subscribe or to pay money, because often those shows, as part of their calls to action, will encourage their audience to give them money. And then they will say, if you give us this amount of money per week or per show, then this will help us produce another 2 episodes. So people have that clear connection between giving money and the result being that they will hear more of their favourite show or more of their favourite content. Now, Patreon is one example. It might be merchandise. There are different examples, but I think that's really relates to thinking about what the benefit is for the audience from taking up that call to action.
Are the show notes still a great place to put links and to send people to find, rather than your website or complicated links, just to say they're going to be in the show notes? Is there evidence to say that people do go to the show notes to click those links?
Yes, I think that's right. I think it depends on the show. I think that's particularly valuable for shows like, a good example might be the ABC's Bang On podcast, where they talk about particular popular cultural examples and they will talk about the videos they've watched or the links they've read from, be it the New Yorker or New York Magazine or whatever it might be. So there's an active link between the audio content and the links. So I think for those kinds of shows, it can play an important role. But also episode descriptions, as you both know, and as I have said to you before, are really valuable in terms of valuable real estate. So it is still worth putting a call to action at the end of your episode description. You obviously want to front load the episode description to have the most interesting stuff at the front. But I think if you're having a regular call to action, it might even be simply to share the link on Twitter, for example, or share the link on Facebook or Instagram. So it's worth tracking those links. You can use shortened links. So I would track it over a period of time to see how valuable that is when it comes to listeners taking up those links, so you're not wasting your time. But I think for the right show and the right approach, yes, that's a really useful tool as a way of encouraging people to engage further, I suppose.
Now, also understanding that your audience is important in all aspects of the podcast production process. How does it relate to calls to action?
My general view is that it's really valuable in any form of media to understand as much as you can about your audience, because that informs what you do, everything about your content, your distribution strategy, your marketing strategy, your audience in terms of how they're engaging via different apps, be it your website, your social channels, because it helps inform your broader picture about where your audience are coming from, who they are. And an example of this as it relates to calls to action might be that if, for example, you're making a food podcast, and there's not much point in encouraging your audience to share the show or links about the show on Twitter when, for example, the majority of your social traffic is coming from Instagram. So it's really about understanding as much as you can about your audience, their habits, your website, your social channels, the downloads, all those things, and then using that to help inform your calls to action and particularly what you're encouraging your audience to do. Social channels are one example, social links are another example. So I would really think about the sort of whole picture of your audience when it comes to thinking about what calls to action is best for your show.
On a similar topic, the language you use is important as well. There's been a shift, for example, from the term subscribe to follow because of Apple now allowing paid podcasts. Do you have other examples of language as it relates to calls to action?
Yes, I do. And I think you're right, Nick, to pick up on that point about changing from subscribe to follow. So for those shows who aren't monetizing via Apple, I would strongly encourage people to change their calls to action from subscribe to follow for that reason. But in terms of general tips, I think one thing I would say with calls to action is that you should use language that really provokes interest or excitement, or dare I say it, enthusiasm. If what you're saying is kind of not that interesting or not that particularly thought-provoking or engaging, then it's pretty unlikely that someone listening is going to actually follow through with what you're suggesting or encouraging them to do. So that comes back to the way you write your scripts and also the way you deliver that as well. So thinking about that as part of the process is really important.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of written, we mustn't forget the written component in producing audio. How does this fit in?
Yes, well, this is back to my other favourite topic of episode descriptions as well, again, in some ways. So we know from various research, Edison's Infinite Dial in both Australia and the US and other countries have picked up on the importance of search, particularly when it comes to Google as a way of audiences discovering podcasts. And many of those people are new not just to your podcast, but probably to podcasts themselves, the medium itself. So really what I'm encouraging people to think about is to have a written call to action on the front page of your blog or website. In the case of the ABC, most of our podcast websites have the phrase listen for free deliberately on our podcast websites. That's something that WNYC Studios do in New York as well. That's not an accident. That's deliberate on their part. So thinking about having a simple, clear written call to action prominently on your website or blog is one part of that equation. The other thing I'd suggest doing comes back to what we were talking about earlier when it comes to episode descriptions themselves. So that is to think about including a written call to action as part of your episode description. So that's probably later in the episode description, not at the front. And that might be encouraging your audience to share a link on Twitter, or it might be a link to buy merchandise or the Patreon account to an associated article or a video. So it really comes back to thinking about the website and the episode descriptions as part of your whole call to action strategy rather than just relying on the audio.
Mm-hmm. Now, on a slightly different topic, we know that at about 74% word of mouth is the best driver of podcast discoverability. But you've written a piece on the importance of newsletters as a key driver as well. When our inboxes are close to bursting, how are podcast newsletters breaking through, Andrew?
Yes, I have a love-hate relationship with email. There are times where my inbox is a disaster zone. I'm sure you can probably relate to that as well. So I'm conscious of how I talk about this, but the one thing I would say is that I think email is ubiquitous. So like it or loathe it, email is ubiquitous. And I think it's been really interesting in the last few years. We've seen the rise of platforms like Substack, what people have called the Substack economy around newsletters and those kinds of approaches. So we're seeing more high-profile writers and journalists take up Substack as a way of kind of focusing on particular niche topics or niche areas. But I would say also that in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a strong rise in the number of podcast recommendation newsletters. So there are great newsletters out there covering the industry as well as covering recommendations. And I think one of the things that for me that's really valuable about these newsletters is that many of the curators are doing some of the filtering for you. In a world where we have new podcasts being added into Apple's database and Spotify's database every week, the discoverability becomes more of a challenge, as I know you've discussed on the show before. And I think the role that newsletter writers, particularly when it comes to podcast recommendations, can play is often overlooked because these people really, many of them love their podcasts. They wouldn't be doing these newsletters if they didn't. And I think that's really valuable when it comes to kind of separating a signal from the noise when it comes to new releases. And the other thing for me is that I'm often quite set in my tastes with podcasts. I'll stick to certain genres and certain areas. But I think the thing I've discovered in the last few years from following many of these newsletters is that often I'll be pushed outside my boundaries a bit when it comes to discovering new genres. And fiction's one genre that I haven't perhaps followed massively. It hasn't been an area of interest for me, but over the last couple of years, I've listened to more fiction podcasts, probably mainly as a result of subscribing to many of these different podcast recommendation newsletters. So that kind of link between podcast recommendation newsletters and serendipity, I think, can be really valuable. And it's probably no surprise also that we've seen some of those newsletter writers go on to be picked up by other media outlets when it comes to writing reviews and other recommendations. The other thing I'd say is that when we're talking about podcasts, and I'm going to use a cliche here, we talk about that intimacy of connection between the audience and the podcaster. Well, I think the same thing can often apply with podcast newsletters. So if you follow a podcast newsletter over a period of time, you build up that sense of trust and that sense of rapport, if that's the right phrase, with the person who's writing those recommendations. And you feel they're almost writing for you. So I think that's another interesting side when it comes to those recommendations of those different newsletters out there.
Well, in your article, you've also listed some fabulous newsletters, which we'll link to in the show notes. Are there a few you can recommend now?
Yes, look, I could probably talk about this for about 10 minutes, so I'll keep it relatively brief. But I mean, one that comes to mind that I'm sure is no surprise to your audience is Pod News, which is an industry newsletter that's run by James Cridland, which is a great source of industry news and information. Hot Pod is another one that I would strongly recommend, run by Nick Qua from the US. But in terms of recommendation newsletters, I think there are a few I'd suggest people checking out. One is the Bello Collective that I've mentioned earlier in the chat, and that is I think I'm right in saying, a fortnightly email newsletter as well as a kind of website that regularly reviews particular genres and particular shows. And they also do more deep dives with podcasters themselves. There's another great one called Podcast the Newsletter, and that's run by a woman called Lauren Passel, who's based in New York. And that comes out weekly. And Lauren is really passionate about her podcasts, which I absolutely love. And it comes through in the newsletter in every sense of the word, which is great. So I look forward to that every week when that comes through. In terms of other newsletters that come out that are not US-based, there's another one I'd recommend called Great British Podcasts, and that comes out weekly, and that's run by the same organisation that run the UK Podcast Awards. And I really like that one because it gives me a different entree into the UK podcast space that perhaps I wouldn't get otherwise. And the final one I'd recommend is one called Pod Squad by a former colleague of mine called Kelly Reardon, who used to run the ABC's Audio Studios team, and she puts out a regular newsletter that often will cover Australian releases as well. So those are 3 or 4 great recommendation newsletters I'd suggest people checking out if they haven't already.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, excellent. Now, finally, Andrew, it's an exciting time for ABC podcasts with the launch of the new series of Unravel called Juanita. So congratulations on that one. We'll actually be speaking to the EP of the series, Ian Walker, soon on this podcast. But how's the launch gone, and what else is in the pipeline from ABC?
Thanks, Nick. Yes, Juanita's an exciting new release from us, and that's one of those shows that we're all hoping will do really well. And so far, the response has been very positive, and I'm hoping that there'll be more interest over the series as it rolls out. But it's great that you're talking to Ian on the show as well. But in terms of other new releases, I'd probably point to 2 real highlights. One is a second series of a great podcast series called Stuff the British Stole by my colleague Mark Fennell that you may have come across. That's a series that looks at the history of objects, and it also is, I guess, exploring colonialism and what those objects say about the past, but also about the present. And that series is going to come out later this year. And the other one to keep an ear out for, I've got to be careful what I say about this one, but is a major new history series that looks back at a very big scandal in the early 1980s in Brisbane. So keep an ear out for that one. And that has national implications in terms of that particular story. So it's a very similar narrative style to a podcast series that we released a few years ago called The 11th, which looked back at the Whitlam era and the constitutional crisis in 1975. So this is a similar history series.
It's a fantastic podcast.
Yeah. Oh, great to hear. Well, this is a similar history show, but albeit a very different topic. But I think that's one that will hopefully have some impact when that comes out later in the year. So things are certainly pretty busy at the ABC at the moment.
Excellent. Well, we better let you get back to it, but you've whet my appetite. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks again so much for joining us on Podcasting Essentials.
Thanks, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to have you on again.
Pleasure, Nick. Pleasure, Nicole. Thank you very much.
Gee, there's so much rich information from Andrew, once again.
And so practical as well.
Really, really practical.
Shall we quickly go through and sum it up?
Let's do that. So when it comes to calls to actions, what you need to think about is more than just ratings and reviews. You need to stick to the one-shot rule. You need to make them easy, benefit-driven. You need to understand your audience and which call to action is going to be more relevant to them. You need to think about the language that you use, and don't forget the written component. And that about sums it up.
It does. Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me.
It's been terrific. Now let's put Andrew's advice into practice. We normally have a couple of calls to action, but today we're just going to do one.
That's right. So the most important thing is, for more information about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au. From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.